Go ahead. Make my day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. It's been a little while since last we spoke. Lots going on. I mentioned that I have two sons going off to college right now, so the last couple of weeks have been packing related, getting ready to go related. The twin number one went last week. Twin number two goes this week. In fact, as you are listening to this, I am most likely dragging things from my car to his dorm, because that's the way life is sometimes. It'll be very interesting with the house removed, with 66% of my children gone. It'll be an interesting new way of looking at the household. But I did find some time before jumping off to take the kids to school, some time to do a show. So I thought I'd put it out there so we could connect once again. So many interesting things. Obviously, as I go through life and do the news and check things out, I'm still putting articles aside at the same pace I always do. So here I find myself 2 weeks into not having done a show with more than 2 weeks worth of articles that I've saved up. So there's lots of really interesting information out there. I think what we're going to do is talk a little bit about foreclosures, because there's some interesting news about that. I've got two articles in mind specifically, and I'm also going to sort of feed into a couple of other interesting stats that I think potentially feed foreclosure concerns. So we've got that to look forward to for today's show. Consider it sort of a foreclosure survey. Now, as you know, for at least for those of you who've been listening for those of you who are new, because I want to point out the probability is I have an awful lot of new listeners. My interview with the host of the YouTube channel 1 Minute Economics, amazing number of people came out and sort of joined the Rebel Underground and have subscribed to the show. So welcome to those folks. By all indications, his book is doing exceptionally well. So I hope for those of you that heard his interview that we did a couple of weeks back, that you were able to take advantage of the sort of the discount price that he was offering to folks who jumped in that first week. It definitely fed the beast, because he ended up moving an awful lot of those things. I believe he was the top rated book in his category. So congrats to him. And if you'd like to check him out, you can find 1 Minute Economics over on YouTube. Just do a search on YouTube and you'll find him that way. Or you can check out the last show I did, which you'll find in the feed of shows for the show at therebelbroker.com. Okay. One thing we've talked about a lot are indicators of stress on the economic market in terms of individuals, right? We've talked about the facilitating of loans in the same way we were doing leading up to the 2007, 2008 downturn, right? But we've talked about how we're just coming at it from the opposite direction. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that. That's an entire show unto itself. Suffice to say, the first time it was, hey, stated income loan. Just tell us how much you say you make and you're good. You want 110%, go for it. So credit ratings and things didn't matter. People just ignored that and didn't really do due diligence on that. This time around, we're being very diligent about that side of the equation, but surprisingly even less so now than we should be. However, now on the other side, we are artificially boosting credit ratings. Now, we've talked a lot about that over the last year. We've talked about the 5 or 6 different specific things that have been done that are artificially increasing credit ratings. If you want to find out more about that, do a search on past shows. But this march towards credit score stupidity continues with an article from the National Association of Realtors. The title of the article, in a celebratory tone, is "Millions of Consumers Getting a Credit Score Boost." An overhaul of in how this is quoting the article now. This is from August 15th of 2018. An overhaul in how several major credit reporting agencies factor in negative credit information is prompting millions of consumer credit scores to rise. Collection events were struck from 8 million consumers' credit reports in the 12 months ending in June. The New York Federal Reserve reported Tuesday that consumers who had at least one collections account removed from their credit reports are seeing an 11-point increase in their scores. Critics have long claimed that such dings to scores are prone to errors or that they have unfairly kept many out of the borrowing market. I've taken a look at this, and this does not seem to be the case. It's an extreme minority of folks who fall into this category. And I'm talking about just the folks who have judgments against them. Some very small segment of those folks are in some way incorrectly being reported. And let me just say, speaking as someone whose credit report was negatively affected by one of these, I've told this story before, and it was years ago, but when I had a surgery, I had this surgery just before I moved to the UK. Took care of getting everything paid before I went, but once I went, I was not getting any more documents on it. And apparently, the anesthetist, the anesthesiologist, needed $8 more. So literally I had a mark on my credit for $8, and it took some letters and it took some time, but I got that taken care of. So there was a process that worked for me anyway to deal with this stuff and to get things dealt with. So the idea that these things should simply be ignored is ridiculous. You're throwing out the good data on the majority of people on this idea that some number have bad data associated with them. So this is all stuff we've talked about before. A lot of this is specifically medical stuff when we've talked about this tons in the last year. So I don't want to get too much into it, but just suffice to say that this march continues. We've covered it. It seems like every quarter, some new thing over the last couple of years that's designed to artificially boost credit ratings, right? We talked about this, how certain judgments against you are now being completely ignored, right? They're being wiped from your record. But then we also talked about how things that should not positively affect your credit are now counted as positive things, like paying your phone bill, paying your electric bill. And of course, those are not credit-based things. Those are service-based things. When you stop paying your power bill, your power gets turned off, right? When you stop paying your phone bill, your phone gets turned off. So this is not a credit thing for most of these. This is a pay for play, pay for service. And as soon as the service stops, as soon as the payment stops, the service stops. So it's not a credit thing. It's absolutely idiotic that this somehow should not, that somehow you paying your power bill should count positively against a credit score. It might be something you want to count in terms of understanding overall indebtedness, right? The percentage of your income that goes to servicing someone's debt, but not as something that should be a positive mark on your credit. So in other words, this 11-point boost folks are getting are added to all these other boosts that folks are getting. We did an article that we covered here on the show a few months back, where it talked about how in many cases people are getting 40 and 50-point boosts overall cumulatively from all these funky things that have happened over the last year. Okay. So that's one thing, right? And what that feeds is a tendency towards over-encumbering people unrealistically. And this is exactly what we did last time. We just did it the other way around. Last time we ignored credit rating. Now we're paying attention to credit rating, but we're screwing with credit rating in a way that artificially boosts it. All right. So that's article number one today. The other thing I want to hit that also hits this, and this one's nuts because remember, this feeds into the debt profile of every American, right? And we've talked about all the various things, whether we're talking about the car loan bubble or we're talking about the education loan bubble. There's a variety of bubbles out there. Again, topics we've covered before. But here's some interesting data that Zero Hedge is bringing to our attention. The headline reads, 1 million Americans default on their student loans every year. Now, the last chunk of data we talked about relating to student loans was that over half of student loan folks who owe money hadn't made payments in the 10 years since they graduated. This was some data we talked about last year. So while the student loan bubble is gigantic, it's also hugely defaulted on. When we've got 1 million students each year just suddenly deciding not to pay their student loans, that's a bad thing. And it absolutely reeks of something that's going to fall on the consumer or the taxpayer, which is you and me. All right. This 1 million American student loans going into default each year, that means that by 2023, approximately 40% of borrowers are expected to default. Now, that's according to a new report by the Urban Institute, a nonprofit research organization dedicated to developing evidence-based insights on critical socioeconomic issues. The researchers there, according to this article, found that 250,000 student loan borrowers see their debts go into default every quarter, and an additional 20 to 30,000 borrowers default on their rehabilitated student loans. And then they've got an interesting table here. Postponing student loan payments through forbearance increases the debt because, remember, interest rates still accrue, right, on these loans. So your indebtedness grows and grows and grows. Now, why is this important? Why does this affect foreclosure numbers? We've talked about indebtedness and its overall effect. When you get to a certain point of indebtedness with people asking you for a certain amount of money that you don't have, you tend to make the same financial decisions in terms of what you're going to stop paying. So what we're creating is a scenario like we had last time in 2007, 2008, where folks found themselves in a crunch and had to start deciding what they aren't going to pay. And one of the things they decided to stop paying was their mortgage. So obviously they're deciding to stop paying their student loans, but how far behind making the decision to not pay that is the decision to not pay your mortgage. The report goes on to describe the relationship between a borrower's credit profile and student loan default in a nationally representative sample of student loan borrowers over the first 4 years of repayment. It found that by the time the student loan falls into the default, the borrower will see their credit score plunge by 60 points to an average of around 550. Borrowers who stay current usually have credit scores in the high 600s. And there's also talk, this is something else I was hearing in some of the outlets, of not letting student loan indebtedness be calculated in your credit rating. So that's something else they're talking about doing. That was actually something I heard from Fannie Freddie, I think. To make the situation worse, defaulting on student loans increases the balance, likely due to collection fees and the accumulation of interest. These myriad consequences that come with a default could be hard to recover from. At best, it delays participation in the American dream. At worst, they are shut out permanently. Okay, student debt is a crisis that many Americans will not be able to recover from. The College Board, a nonprofit organization, says the average cost of a U.S. degree is $34,740 a year at a private college, minus living costs. Graduates of the class of 2016 owe a staggering $37,000 each in student loans. Total student loans owned and securitized outstanding has surpassed the 1.5 trillion mark. Now that's the number I wanted to make sure we covered in terms of how big of a nut this is. And you heard me right. That's $1.5 trillion in the second quarter of 2018. It's the second only to home mortgages among categories of consumer debt, and the main reason Americans' household debt was swelled to a record high. They go on to say here that credit bubbles are all the same. It just happens that the life cycle of the student debt bubble is nearing a deleveraging period, according to both Keynesian and monetarist theory. When the student debt bubble cracks, the state should intervene directly and bail out the millennials who made terrible life decisions on accumulating massive amounts of debt for a worthless liberal arts degree, simply because the myth of going to college would usher in a higher paying job. As has become increasingly evident, that is not the case in today's gig economy. The failing education system has duped millennials. They have now realized that the greatest con of all time is college. Now, that's obviously an opinion provided there at the end. You can decide whether or not you believe that. But when you look at the statistics of folks getting hired and you look at the difference from just 20 years ago of what the earnings were, right? If you calculate the averages and how much of a boost having a college degree gets you, college becomes not the lucrative thing that it was not that long ago. So why is that also important to consider? Well, it negatively affects their ability to pay back their loan. It negatively affects their debt to income ratio. And those are all things that play into whether or not they can become buyers. But if we find a scenario, and this is likely to happen with the number of folks in this boat, I think it's extremely likely that there will be a move. There already is. There's already talk about it in the press to not count student debt against you in your credit rating. And if we do that, that is a gigantic nail in the coffin of the economy, because if you're not paying attention to the debt relating to education, you are making it 10 times easier for these folks to default on the next thing, which would be mortgages if they have one, but would simply be to not pay. What's the motivation at that point to pay off that student loan? And I don't know about you, but I do not want to own as a taxpayer $1.5 trillion worth of outstanding student debt. Okay, as promised, we've kind of set the stage here a little bit with a few things that I think are feeding this potential foreclosure beast. When we come back, we're going to talk about some interesting, and I hate to even call them milestones. They're more like headstones in the road. But we're going to talk about some of these creepy things going on in the foreclosure world right after we come back, so don't go away. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. We're talking foreclosures. We've just sort of set the stage a little bit, made reference to some of the things that we've talked about in past shows, laid the groundwork for an interesting segment of the economy in terms of student loans being in trouble. So set kind of a creepy stage. This topic is also worth going back and listening to some of my past shows that have laid the bricks of really crazy lending practices that really closely emulate what we did the last time, just from the opposite direction, right? Which we discussed earlier in this show. But let's jump into some other interesting data here, because it's concerning, and particularly when we consider some of these areas where this is happening. And what is this? Well, this is a rising foreclosure rate. Now, I also I'm a subscriber to Realty Track, right, which is a source of properties that are in pre-foreclosure, in foreclosure, and about to go to auction. And I'm seeing more stuff happening there, which is a little bit concerning, because this is my area. This is the Silicon Valley area, where there should be no reason for this to be happening. I'm going to try and accumulate more data for you to give you a more localized view on it. But what's interesting here is, according to this, 44% of metros are seeing an increase in foreclosures. Now, you can find this at Realtor Magazine. And of course, as I've mentioned before, Realtor Magazine is not the place that usually shares bad news. They typically like to share news that is going to boost business, that's going to boost the number of agents. So I guess from that perspective, we could look at it like, well, this is their opportunity to say this is a great time to jump in and buy, right? If this is an indicator of a market where things are becoming more competitive for buyers. Now, also keep in mind, at the same time we're talking about this, I realize we're talking doom and gloom, but the last time I did numbers on Silicon Valley, which isn't that long ago, it's just a few weeks ago now, I usually do them once a month. We were still seeing a scenario of lower sales, higher prices, homes selling for over asking price, less aggressively as we have seen previously. So clearly a slowdown, but we were still seeing that, right? We're still seeing more buyers than there are sellers. We're just not seeing as many buyers per home as we were seeing before. So, but still to the point where you're seeing homes selling for over asking price or at asking price, except for at the high end. At the high end, I'm seeing homes going through price reductions, and I'm seeing stay on the market longer. And for me, in my local market, that's about 1.1 million or higher. And once you get there, that phenomena seems to start happening. Now, that's a moving target. And again, we've talked about how you can figure this out in your own marketplaces. Here in Morgan Hill, it's about 1.1 million. Up in places like Sunnyvale and Santa Clara, in a lot of areas, it's more like 1.6 million, right? The things don't start to get soft or crazy until you get to that point. Okay, so what's interesting here is this idea that we're seeing nearly half of metro areas, or at least the metro areas surveyed by this article, are experiencing increased foreclosures. Quoting the article now, and this is from August 21st, more foreclosures sprang up this summer across the country. 44%, or 96 of 219 metro areas, saw foreclosures tick up in July compared to a year ago. according to a newly released report from ATTOM Data Solutions, a real estate data firm. This marks the first annual increase in foreclosure starts nationwide after 3 years of year-over-year declines each month. Now, for those of you who subscribe to my Twitter feed, you know that these are numbers I tend to share with you. And seeing them after all of this time, as mentioned here, it's been 3 years that we've not seen any increases in foreclosures. In fact, foreclosures have been declining consistently over that time. And now to see them sort of do a pivot is another indicator, I think, of a market that is at the very least flattening or retreating in some areas. The report shows that 30,187 U.S. properties started the foreclosure process for the first time in July. The increase in foreclosure starts is not just a one-month anomaly, according to Darren Bloomquist, Senior Vice President with Adam Data Solutions. He says the trend has already been popping up in recent months. In local markets, July represented the third consecutive month with a year-over-year increase in 33 metro areas, including Los Angeles, Miami, Houston, Detroit, San Diego, and Austin. Now, this is what's a blowaway for me in terms of understanding the various marketplaces that we pay attention to, right? We've spent time talking about Los Angeles, Miami, not so much Detroit. I'm not a huge fan of Detroit. Detroit has challenges. San Diego, Houston, and Austin, all communities that have seen dramatic growth. That what's interesting about it is these are still markets where the underpinnings of the market are strong, right? Good jobs. I still get people I talk to here that are being courted by companies in Houston and Austin and San Diego and Boise. I don't think Boise's on this list, but these are areas where if you were to come up with, here's my top 10 list of metro areas that I think over the next year are going to see an increase in foreclosures, I wouldn't be putting Los Angeles, Austin, San Diego, and Houston on that list. Absolutely not. Would Detroit be on that list? Yeah, it would. Would Chicago be on that list? Yeah, it would. But that's just from things that we kind of, as consumers of real estate information at all, or socioeconomic things, that's why we put those things on there. You can't help but look at a Detroit or a Chicago and think, yeah, that's a market in decline, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean don't invest. It means either invest super wisely, right? Pick those markets, because in every market, even in a declining metro area, you're going to find sub-markets within there that are the pearls, right? That are going to be really good potential investments. You just have to be real savvy about them, and that's where ground truth comes in, something else we've talked a lot about. But stuff like this is creepy. According to the same gentleman from ATOM, gradually loosening lending standards over the last few years have introduced a modicum of risk back into the housing market. Well, isn't that interesting? What we just talked about, the loosening of lending standards, is contributing to folks not being or getting over encumbered. Now, when did we start talking about this? We started talking about this. This is 2018. And I remember at the time we were talking about it being a few years off, and that potentially how long would it take to prime the pump of bad loans? Remember, we had about 6 years of priming the pump with bad loans last time. From about 2001, 2002 is when popularity really hit with that stupid lending, and it burst on us 2007, 2008, right? And that was an aggressive priming of the pump. Lots of homes were out there. Builders were building tons of homes. So the volume over that period is much higher than the volume we've experienced over the last 6 years. However, we're now at the point where even when we add a couple of years to that number in order to try to compensate for the last lack of volume we had last time, we're kind of there. And it's hard to pin down. Where is the critical mass, right? Where's the critical mass moment where we've got enough stupid loans floating around out there? And the only thing we need, the only cherry on the top we need, is that we have recreated loan instruments or investment vehicles that bundle all these loans together, right? That would be it. The higher risk loans, that would be the ultimate. And it's subprime lending all over again. Don't let anyone ever tell you any different. It is exactly the same as subprime lending. It is feel-good lending rather than be smart lending, and which is what we did last time. Again, that's a topic we've covered ad nauseum in the past, but we can, if everyone's got the hots to talk about it, we could do that again sometime. Okay, so he goes on to talk about how loosening these standards have been a bad thing, quote, and that additional risk resulting in rising foreclosure starts in a diverse set of markets across the country. And I this is one of those moments where I hate to say I told you so, but we've been talking about this being something that's going to happen when the pump got primed enough years ago. When they first started doing this dumbing down of lending, when they started doing this more aggressive lending, which is, we talked about some crazy examples from the last 2 years, but it's been going on for the last, since 2012, 2011. So we're there. We're at that point where we're 6 years in, and now we're into that point where we're going to be able to prime the pump closer to where we were before over time, a longer time, simply because we've had lower volume than we did last time. Okay. Bloomquist says, most susceptible to rising foreclosure starts are affordability challenged markets where home buyers are more financially stretched, and markets with some type of trigger event, such as a natural disaster or large scale layoffs. Or what else? Dramatically increased tax burden, some sort of policy shift. And another side thing, I don't want to get distracted too much by the shiny thing, but something else I wanted to share with you. We talked about alienating business in California and what might be things that kick off an exodus of big companies. So one other thing, and I don't think this has actually been passed yet, but the California legislature is talking about passing a law that mandates the number of women that must be on the board of directors of corporations. And they define, these numbers would only take effect on corporations of a certain size. But of course, they're after the big ones. So those are the ones you absolutely don't want to piss off because you don't want them to move away. And bear in mind, the stage we're setting for big business. Now we're telling big business you must have X number of females in your board of directors because that makes sense, I guess. And if you agree with that, fine. But if I was a owner of a company that met the requirements of size, and I had a board of directors that was working extremely well, and my business was humming along, I am not going to promote someone simply based on their gender. Dude or chick does not matter. It's about the business, right? And if someone gets brought on board that brings enough to the table that they're worth the pay because of what they bring, great. Mandating the gender of that person, for my money, is the straw that breaks the camel back. And if I was considering moving, a rule like this being passed, I'm done. I would leave. I would move my company. And remember all the things we've talked about that are feeding this decision. Already, 50% of people who live in this area want out, right? And that's huge. That's gigantic. That number's typically been lower than 20% in the past, but over the last 4 or 5 years has grown every single year, so that to this year, we've got a number creeping up on 50. I think it's 46, 47, 48%, right in that ballpark. So you've got a workforce that likely, statistically, at least half of your workforce is A-okay with not living here anymore. That's been one thing that folks have kept in mind in the past. They haven't wanted to move because they realized they'd lose 70, 80% of their employees who don't want to move away from California. Well, that's not true anymore. Now you'd statistically likely only lose 50%. But then there's the other element of the equation where these folks can move. These businesses can move, and even if they don't do pay cuts to the people they're taking with them, they still end up boosting their bottom line because they can move to an area where the taxes are lower and the cost of living is lower. So they can offer to their employees the opportunity to relocate, keep the same pay, but in terms of net power, in terms of financial power, they're moving to an area where it's going to cost them, their month-to-month costs are far lower. So it's like getting a raise, right? And that's a huge draw. And I hear a lot more about that. I get people talking to me who call me about listing their home because their company's going to move out of the area and they're going to go with them, these kinds of things. All right. The metro areas with a population of at least 200,000 that had the highest foreclosure rates in July were Atlantic City, New Jersey, 1 in every 448 housing units with a foreclosure filing, which is scary. Peoria, Illinois, 1 in every 622. Fayetteville, North Carolina, 1 in every 683, Trenton, New Jersey, 1 in every 703, and Philadelphia, 1 in every 851. Now, that's just sort of a broad overview. Let's take a second to look at some of these foreclosure changes, which are absolutely nuts. I'm also going to put a link in the description of today's show to the actual article from Adam Data. I think it's absolutely worth your time. It's not protected. It's not behind a paywall. So I think it's worth you checking out. But some of these numbers are just mind-boggling. Let me run through them. First, let's start with Los Angeles. And for each one, for the months of May, June, and July, I want to read to you the percentage increase in foreclosures from the same time the previous year. Because in every one of these communities, it's more, right? It's none of these saw a decrease. Every single one of them saw an increase. Los Angeles, California, in May, a 14% increase from the previous year in foreclosures. In June, a 2% increase. Now remember, June is a sexy month for most areas. And I know people tell you want to sell your home in August on the national average, and that may be true in the national average. But I know in my marketplace, the real magic month is June. It may be the same in LA. So if that is the real magic month, and that may explain why you see fewer foreclosures in the month of June, because folks are liquidating instead of seeing foreclosure procedures going on, so their debt goes away. In July, a 20% increase. So in the past 3 months of data, July was the highest month. We're going to see that trend continue. In Miami, May, a 4% increase in foreclosures. In June, a 35% increase from the June previous in foreclosures. In July, a 29% increase in foreclosures in Miami. In Houston, and this number is nuts, in May, a 153% increase in foreclosures. In June, I'd love to know the raw numbers. I mean, if you only had 2 foreclosures and suddenly they were 5 foreclosures in Houston, it's statistically significant when comparing numbers, but so that's always another thing to keep in mind is sometimes with these, you'll find these crazy numbers, percentages, but when you realize it's a really, really small source, a sample size, it kind of explains things. But it goes on here because no matter how you slice it, we're seeing a consistent increase. So that's kind of also what you're looking for because you're trying to spot the trend, right? June, a 62% increase in foreclosures from the year previous. July, a 76% increase from the previous year. And Florida is pretty well represented on this list. Jacksonville, Florida, in May, 22% increase. June, 22% increase. July, 81% increase. Orlando, Florida, May, 12% increase. June, 22% increase. July, 41% increase. Detroit, and these numbers actually surprise me for how low they are. May, 31% increase. June, 32% increase. July, 71% increase. Minneapolis, St. Paul, May, 47% increase. June, 100% increase in foreclosures. July, 32% foreclosures. San Diego, May, 20% increase. June, 7% increase. July, 20% increase. Indianapolis, Indiana, May, 94% increase. June, 12% increase. July, 107% increase. Austin, Texas, May, 65% increase. June, 44% increase. July, 29% increase. Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Florida, May is 11%. June is 64%. July is 59%. Absolutely amazing in terms of this being a pivotal trend. Now, remember, one thing we've talked about in past shows, you're looking for events. You're looking for pivotal events on which the market turns. This feels like another. This is what, the 4th, maybe 5th pivotal event we've talked about over the last 3 or 4 months that should be absolutely part of anybody's review of the market, determine what the smart move to make is next time. Let's see. And yes, that's the sexiest data on there. Absolutely fascinating data. This makes it, if you are someone who's looking for deals at this point and you've got the cash to do it, you're going to want to talk to lenders. Buying foreclosed properties is not always the easiest. If you can get there in a pre-foreclosure situation, it's better. Anytime and if you've got the fortitude to push through some of the horrible situations that folks find themselves in with foreclosures. I've mentioned that in an early iteration of my interest in real estate in the mid to late 90s, I spent an awful lot of time in Auburn, California, doing exactly this. I would go down to City Hall. I'd pull up all of the folks who'd gotten foreclosure notices. I would reach out to them. And it was a mix of folks who in the minority numbers were just folks in a tough situation and were heartbroken. And then a more of a majority of folks who just were making very bad life decisions and doing stupid things and paying the price for that. And you have to tread the water in both of those, and it can suck the life right out of you if you're able to manage that and try to make it a good situation. The goal you should have is to make a bad situation better. And anybody who can bring that to a situation like that deserves whatever they earn out of that. But this feels like a scenario where getting into this mix, getting into this market again, and looking at foreclosures as a potential place to acquire your next property, I think is reasonable. I know I am paying closer attention to foreclosures in my area, to the point where I'm now looking like I'm going to schedule some time to show up to foreclosure auctions and see what's going on. But I'm also getting notices now on pre-foreclosure properties that are just getting that notice. In my area, most of those are not making it to auctions. You get that first notice usually gets dealt with. Either the current owner gets current, or they renegotiate their loan, or something happens so that they can stay in the house. But I am sending out cards to those folks because I think this is a potential growth area. At least statistically, nationally, we're seeing in a lot of metro areas this is happening. I would suggest potentially making it part of your strategy as well. All right, folks, it's about that time. I hope this has been valuable information for you. I honestly believe that we have reached the point where, at least as something you might want to tack on to your regular real estate stuff. Clearly, if you're in that mode where you're looking for real estate stuff, you're probably subscribing to some searches on Trulia, Zillow, maybe through the MLS with your favorite real estate professional. Let me suggest you start pinging the potential opportunities of foreclosed properties. Realty Track is a great way to do that. That's how I'm tracking, and I get mails as soon as properties come into the hopper. And here's a suggestion. There's a couple of ways you can do this. As a real estate person, I do a postcard. I have a bunch of pre-printed postcards that are specifically have a message that is directed at these folks. It doesn't talk about foreclosure. You don't want to air their laundry to themselves. They already know what situation they're in. So for me, I try to phrase it in a way that says, hey, I can help you get the best possible results out of the marketing your home, that can help you get out from under any financial obligations that you're feeling pressured by, that kind of thing. I don't do big, bold letters. Hey, you're in foreclosure. Let's fix it kind of a thing. However, I think if you're coming at it from a not real estate agent perspective, if you're coming at it from an investor perspective, you could go one of two ways. Have yourself a great letter that is written up and have it be, do the whole hand addressing and all that kind of wonderful stuff. Use a real stamp. And as soon as you see these things come up, send that out. And I'm toying with doing the same thing myself, because honestly, for the majority of these folks, I'd be more interested in buying them myself than selling it for them. So it's double-edged. It depends on how I want to try to leverage it. But for you, it might not be that. You may not be a licensed real estate person, so you are someone who wants to invest. All it's going to cost you is a stamp, and I think that it's worth doing. So you might want to make this part of your process moving forward. All right, anyway, as I said, hope this has been valuable information for you. The goal is always to leave you with more value on the table than time invested. Hope we've achieved that today. Thanks again for listening, everyone. I will talk to y'all next time.